From Kalamazoo, direct to you, it's a WKZO.com quickcast.
Former presidential advisor Karl Rove appeared at a Portage Meijer Thursday to sign copies of his memoir. People lined up more than an hour before the event. This lady was first in line.
Why are you the first in line?
Because I thought there would be a huge long line, and I've been here since 8:30, so wanted to be as close as I could to the front of the line to see Karl Rove.
And why are you such a fan of Karl Rove?
I'm extremely conservative, and I appreciate his views, and I think that is the right direction. I'm interested to see what he says in his book.
Mr. Rove came out and spoke to the media before the public filed through.
Mr. Rove, speaking of taxpayers taking the risk, do you think the $75 million cap should be lifted on British Petroleum's liability for the damages in the Gulf of Mexico?
They're going to end up paying significantly more than $75 million. They've already put out somewhere near $500 million, and the impression is the tab is going to be much higher than that, and they've said they're going to pay it.
How's your book different than other books about the Bush administration?
I was there. I officed 15 steps from the Oval Office, and I was there for a long period of time. I'm not a commentator on the outside who's trying to divine what happened. I sat there. I'm the guy who walked over and said, Mr. President, planes flew to the World Trade Center. You know, I sat there in the meetings where we talked about important policy decisions. I'm in the cabinet of Air Force One when President Bush is meeting with Dick Gephardt. I'm the guy who has to accept the phone call from the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid about Democrats blocking judges. So, I mean, I was there, and I tried with as much frankness as I could to write about my experiences.
Well, Rove and Associates, do you see your group doing managing any other presidential campaigns?
Rove and Company is the thing that I do my Fox, my Newsweek, my Wall Street Journal, my speeches, and my book under. We don't do political campaigns.
Do you see yourself ever doing a managing
I will
campaign?
always be involved in politics because that's I love politics, but you can't go back in life, and I won't go back into the consulting business. And while I'm never going to say never, I can't imagine that I'd run another presidential campaign. Most people are involved in one. I did too, and that was the hardest work I ever had to do.
Is there a candidate out there that if they came to you and said, we'd like you to manage the campaign, that you're that passionate about this person that you'd say yes?
I'm not focused on 2012. I'm focused on 2002.
What was the reaction from the administration when they found you were writing a book, An Inside Tale? Were they supportive of you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, President Bush encouraged me when I left. In fact, when we sat and talked about my departure, he said, "I hope you'll consider writing a book." So yeah.
Since the president left office, it seems like even conservatives are taking more shots at him particularly about spending. Do you think those shots are fair, and why do you think that's...
Yeah, well, first of all, I disagree with the premise. I think conservatives are becoming, all Americans, a lot of Americans are recalculating what they thought of Bush. I had a guy come up to the airport the other day to me, actually a couple of months ago now, and he said, sort of surly guy, said, "Are you Karl Rove?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I never voted for Bush either time." He said, "I voted for Obama." And I said, "Great." He said, "In the last year I've learned something." I said, "What is that?" He said, "It ain't as easy as it looks, is it?" I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Tell Bush he has my newfound respect." And I think there's that reappraisal going underway. Now, as to the question of spending, page 414.
Okay.
There is a myth about Bush and spending. When we came into office, the discretionary domestic budget of the United States, Clinton's last budget, FY01, was growing at 16% a year. I've got the exact numbers in the book on page 414, but we cut it to like 6% in our first budget growth, 5% in our second, 4% in our third, 2.2% in our fourth, and flatlined at less than inflation the last 4 years we were in office. For example, FY08 was $391 billion in discretionary domestic spending. FY09 is $393. You do the math. $2 billion on a base of $391 billion ain't a big increase, less than inflation. Not even, real terms, not growing the government spending.
Although folks would say that domestic spending is only a part of...
Well, that's my point, is that's what a president most directly affects. Were we spending more on war? You bet. Mm-hmm. Did we spend more on border security? You bet. No apologies. We doubled the size of the Border Patrol and tripled its budget. You bet. Bush also had the courage to say, look, we have a problem in our budget, and that so much of our budget is mandatory spending that is out of control. I refuse to add to it by making veteran spending mandatory, and I think we ought to reform Social Security and Medicare in order to reduce over the long haul the demands on our economy by these two programs. He's the first president to have the courage to do that. Remember, Social Security used to be the third rail of politics. Don't talk about it because you get burned. Well, he has made it easier for future presidents to tackle what is driving up spending over what a president doesn't have as much control over, which is mandatory. And on the discretionary side, he ratcheted it down. Unlike our current president, who between January 20th of last year and November 1st of last year asked for and got an 8% increase in the middle of the fiscal year in discretionary non-security spending, and then turned around and asked for, on top of the 8% new baseline, a 12% increase, which translates into a 25% increase in the discretionary domestic spending budget of the United States between January 20th and November 1st of last year.
Can you give us a word on each one of these people? Karl Rove.
Stamp collector.
All right.
He and I are both philatelists.
Debbie Stabenow.
Great promise. I want to express gratitude for her having done such a lousy job that she spent sending her jobs and paychecks to Texas.
Okay. Jennifer Granholm.
I'm sorry. That was Jennifer Granholm.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I'm sorry. Not that effective. Ineffective. Sort of backbencher.
Okay. Pete Hoekstra.
Passionate, smart, West Michigan values.
John Engler.
Fun, smart, visionary.
You mentioned the war a second ago, sir. A chance to answer your critics. Yes or no, did the Iraq War make America safer?
Yes, absolutely. Can you imagine what the world would be like with Saddam Hussein in control of the third largest oil reserves in the world, in the heart of the Middle East, with the sanctions, the United Nations sanctions, which were clearly failing, in control, with those sanctions gone? He explicitly told us after he was captured that he wanted to restart his biological and chemical programs and was diverting tens of millions of dollars a year from the oil for food program to keep together the engineers and technicians and dual-use facilities so he could do that. So we would have a resurgent Saddam in the heart of the Middle East with a lot of oil money in an arms race with Iran, which would provoke a further arms race with Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt, and a guy who had a reputation of funding terrorism, paying off suicide bomber families, for example. And that would be a disaster.
Let me ask you this. Would you support airstrikes on nuclear facilities in Iran?
I think we need to be very careful about exhausting all alternatives. Nothing should be off of the table, but we ought to use every tool at our disposal before using force.
How about a military response to North Korea for sinking the South Korean warship?
We ought to work in close conjunction with our ally South Korea to frame the appropriate response.
In your epilogue to the book, you say about walking through the gates of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
You read the book. I'm flattered. At least you read the prologue and the epilogue. And the chapter on and the 5 pages on U.S. attorneys.
I skimmed fast. That afternoon, I thought I knew more than I actually did. What were the essential truths that you learned in the meanwhile?
I learned about really the fundamental greatness of our country, and I learned a lot about the stresses and strains and demands on our system of government. I mean, it is a human enterprise, and we like to think of it as we endow, the people who we send to Washington, particularly the people we send to the White House, with sort of superhuman powers, and it's a human enterprise, and a human enterprise is going to be imperfect and difficult and often contentious, and the information you have is sometimes murky, and you just have to give it the best shot you can. I mean, I used to think, a president has such power of information collection that it must all be clear to him. And then I found these decisions are oftentimes close calls because the information is imperfect and the outcomes are not as clear as you might think.
For WKZO.com News, I'm Sean Patrick.